Nowadays regarding the mitzvah of Techeles. I remember when I was growing up and I was davening with my father in Muncie, New York, and we would daven next to each other all the time. And of course, a major part of davening is the recitation of Kriya Shema. And at one point in time, my father turned to me and he said, it's really disturbing to me because this is such an important part of our religion, the mitzvah of tzitzis, and I read all the time that it says v'nasnu al tzitzis hakanaf v'sil techeles. There's supposed to be a thread or some amount of threads of techeles, of a blue-dyed wool strings that's supposed to be hanging on our tzitzis. And he says, but our tzitzis is all completely white and we don't have any of this techeles wool and we're not fulfilling the mitzvah properly. And he said, it's such a depressing thing. Maybe we should really try to get back to Techeles. I just remember this conversation when I was a young child, and it just had never really occurred to me why it is that we don't have the Techeles nowadays. I don't know what year exactly. It's when
I'm just wondering if it was around the time.
This was the Techeles, the modern day Techeles that's been discovered was really in the 1980s. But this conversation probably took place when I was growing up in the 1970s. And then, over the years, it became not only a theoretical discussion. I really started to wonder about it myself. I just assumed, like the Midrashim say. The Midrashim say that the Techeles was nignas, that there are certain things we don't have anymore. We don't have a Urim V'Tumim anymore. We don't have a Beis HaMikdash anymore. There are certain things we don't have. So somehow we lost the formula, the recipe, the knowledge about exactly how to manufacture Techeles. And I have in the materials, there are a number of different Midrashim that have this idea that it says that even early Midrashim speak about a Masa Geshu Techeles v'achshav ein lanu elo loban shetecheles nignas. The Techeles was put away, and there's a famous Arizal where the Arizal seems to indicate that the Techeles is only something that we were worthy of the time of the Beis HaMikdash, but after the time of the Churban, that so somehow we're not worthy of having the Techeles anymore. Maybe it's not necessary. We're not on the level to have the Techeles. That comment of the Arizal is a peculiar comment because if you look in the various Gemaras, but particularly in Maseches Menachos, it does appear that they had Techeles, that there were at least some people who were wearing Techeles. At a certain point in time, it became maybe dangerous to manufacture Techeles because it was a royal blue that was used specifically by royalty. So it seems that based on the Gemara and Sanhedrin Daf Yud Beis, it's not in the materials that it was dangerous to go and to try to obtain a Techeles, and you didn't want the governmental officials to catch you, and if they did, they could imprison you, they could put you to death. Some say maybe that's the reason it fell out of use, because there was a Sakanas Chayim to utilize the Techeles when it was something that was wanted so much by the government. But there seemed to be this idea in the Arizal, the Chabad community certainly picked up on this, and one of the Chabad Rebbeim, who was it? The Rashab apparently said that this is a Kabbalah that they have based on the Midrashim, that it's not appropriate for us to try to reobtain the Techeles nowadays, because this is something which is supposed to be left for Mashiach. But even if the Arizal made a comment of this sort, it wasn't in a halachic context. We say that when the Arizal says something as a matter of halacha, so he has the status of an important achron, which means that the important achronim, when they said a matter of halacha, we take it very seriously. And certainly if there aren't others who disagree, we follow their opinion. Certainly when the Arizal says something which is a Kabbalistic notion, which is not in direct contradiction to things that we derive from the Gemara, so then we generally follow the Kabbalah. The Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Tefillin has a whole set of rules of when you follow the Kabbalah, when you follow the Halacha. So the Arizal ranks very, very high. But nonetheless, we wouldn't necessarily follow the Arizal in this particular context because, number one, the Arizal wasn't saying it as a halachic statement. He was saying it more as kind of like a midrashic or hashkafic metaphysical statement, so it wasn't in a halachic context. And number two, the Arizal is one authority. But if you have a pasuk in the Torah and you have lots of Gemaras that seem to go contrary to that, so we wouldn't, even though it's the Arizal is very chashuv, it wouldn't necessarily carry the day and be the bottom line. So therefore, in the 1980s, when it was found that the Murex trunculus, so Murex trunculus was identified as a snail that seemed to have a lot of the characteristics of what the Torah refers to as the chilazon. So there was a movement to actually utilize the blue dye that could be extracted from this Murex trunculus, and the one who had identified this snail, which lived in the region in next to Tyre, northern Israel, on the coast, basically where you had the Zebulun, the Chop Yamim Yishkon, where it was, we have a tradition, that's where the Techeles was manufactured. The location, the geography, and topography, everything really checked out in terms of this snail. And Yitzchak Isaac Herzog, who had written a whole dissertation, a doctoral dissertation, I think, on this particular subject of the Techeles, he thought that this was a very good contender. But the problem was that Techeles seems to be Dom El Yam. That's what all of the sugyas talk about, how Techeles is a Dom El Yam, and it's, this is what the Gemara talks about. That why is the manishtana Techeles mikol atzibon? And the Gemara says, "Menesha Techeles Dom El Yam, and Yam Dom El Rakia, Rakia Dom El Evan Sapiv, Evan Sapiv Dom El Yis Kisei Hakavod." That it brings, it evinces sort of the recollection of the Kisei Hakavod, some sort of shade of blue. Now, there were different Rishonim, we're talking about what that shade of blue is. Is it light blue? Is it black? Sort of a blackish blue? Is it, Rashi in one place says Yarok, which seems a little bit odd. What is yellow, or green, or however you're going to translate Yarok, you have to do a blue. Maybe it's a bluish green, a greenish blue. But the problem that Rav Herzog discovered is that the dye that was extracted from this snail wasn't blue, it was purple. It was purple. And therefore he felt that it just didn't work. But then somehow somebody in the 1980s, they discovered that if you expose the secretion of this snail to the sunlight, so it turns blue. It turns blue. Actually, first it goes through a process in which it becomes yellow, and then it becomes blue. And so that could also help to explain the Yarok translation. And then it becomes blue. So they said, Eureka! We've discovered that this is really the Techeles. So at that point in time, I remember that there was a Yom Iyun, that there was a day of a special learning program that they set aside at Yeshiva University at that point in time. And there were 3 speakers, all who said that they think that this is the genuine Techeles, or that there's such a good chance that it's the genuine Techeles that you can't go wrong wearing or putting this on your tzitzis. And the 3 speakers were Rav Hershel Schachter and Rabbi Norman Lamb and Rabbi Moshe David Tema. And all 3 of them started wearing Techeles, and Rav Schachter Yibadul Chaim Tovim is the only one who's still here. But he was just here visiting Chicago the other week, and you look at his talis, and he wears Techeles, and it's a very clear thing. So Schachter, out of the 3, was the one who didn't say bevados that it's absolutely the Techeles, because we lost our Masorah at one point in time. So this is there was an early effort to identify the Techeles in the late 19th century. The truth of the matter is that there are various versions of kind of the Kabbalistic tradition that the Techeles was Nignaz and it's going to be lost forever. According to one version, it's only until the year Tafshin in 1840. So around 1870 or so, the Virginia Rebbe, who identified the cuttlefish. He thought that the cuttlefish was definitely the Techeles, because he thought that it satisfied a lot of the characteristics. A lot of the characteristics that are identified in the Gemara, you don't know how much of them are me'akev, how much of them are just sort of metaphysical nature. Like it says, it's ole akas shivim shana. Ole akas shivim shana. What creature do we have that only surfaces once out of 70 years? If it's the Murex trunculus, so that's something which it's readily obtainable. It's not something which only surfaces once out of 70 years. That's one of the criticisms to say, how could it be? But others say, no, 170 or 70 years means that it's not something which comes up all the time. And maybe it used to be that once every 70 years, there would be like a great gathering of they would have lemurs that would all get together, once every so many years. Great gathering of chilazon that would come up, and maybe that doesn't necessarily happen anymore, but it's not necessarily a ikuva. Then it would say that it's a v'yasa doma ladag. The Gemara Menachos says that it's gufo doma liyam, gufo doma liyam. So you look at its body, what does it mean? It's doma liyam. It doesn't necessarily look like the color of the sea. So you say it means maybe it's like a clearish color. So that maybe that's what it means. We don't know what gufa doma liyam dome. whenever the word dome is used, dome just means that it could resemble in all kinds of ways. It could resemble in color, it could resemble in shape, it could resemble in hue, it could resemble. The dome is not a word that is necessarily fully understood. It could be fully understood by the speaker, but not by the hearer, so it's not necessarily going to shoot it out of the park if you feel that it's not dome. It says, V'yasa dome l'dag, that it's similar to a fish. They say it's not actually a fish, it's a snail. But then again, Rashi, at least in Avodah Zarah, seems to translate the word chilazon as a snail in terms of the definition that Rashi gives over there. He says, Nimin balaz min chilazon, and the nimin apparently in Old French is equivalent to something like a snail. But anyway, so Rav Leiner, who was the Regina Rav, so he thought that it was the cuttlefish, and he was so convinced that based on his own identification of the simanim that it was the cuttlefish, that he was very disappointed that he couldn't figure out how to extract the dye in such a way that the dye would be blue. So he got a chemist. He found a chemist, I think an Italian chemist, that would help him out. And the chemist found some sort of a solution where you could have the different dyes that would be applied to it. So the whole question, is that what you're supposed to do, or is it just supposed to naturally be extracted in this particular color? That's the Machlokes Rashi and Rambam. Rashi seems to indicate that it's just sort of a natural color that comes from the chilos, and the Rambam indicates no, there are samamonim that you. So the Rambam gives you a whole recipe as to the samamonim that you're supposed to use in order to identify the chilos. And so what happened with the Regina Techeles, which is still used by the Regina Hasidim, they still have a factory in Eretz Yisrael, is that this chemist figured out how to produce this dye. But the truth of the matter is that you would produce this dye with the ingredients that he used, even if you didn't have the fish at all. There was nothing that was left over in the blood or secretion of this cuttlefish that was leading to this blue color. The blue color was coming solely, exclusively from the dye. So the whole thing was a big... it wasn't a fraud because he didn't think it was a fraud. He relied very much on the chemist, but the whole thing was a giant blunder. That it wasn't really, according to Rav Herzog, showed very decisively and conclusively that this wasn't really the Techeles. But he said, we're not going to give up. He said, this is a mitzvah d'oraisa to have Techeles, so therefore he tried very hard to figure out what the Techeles really was. So at that time, in the 1870s or so, when the Regina Rav came up with his cuttlefish idea, which is a squid basically, it's not a fish or a snail, it's a squid. So when he came up with his idea of the cuttlefish, he got letters from various Gedolim explaining, politely why they disagreed with him. And one of the letters that he got was written by a very close acquaintance of the Beis Halevi, and it's published in the Sefarim. You can find this a very good sefer Lulos Techeles that publishes that published that letter and other things as well. Goes through all of the different proofs and the disproofs and so forth and so forth. So the letter from the Beis Halevi basically said, we have the actual version of the letter that was published, that there's such a thing as Mesorah, that you need to have a Mesorah, that something has been missing from our tradition for a very long time, and you can't rely upon new discoveries and new evidence. But he says, particularly in this context, where the cuttlefish was a fish that was known by everybody, and it's not so hard to figure out how to extract the blood of the cuttlefish. And if this was, in fact, a fish where the dye that would be extracted would be the appropriate dye for the Techeles strings, so then we would have known about it. We would have had the Mesorah from our grandparents, our great-grandparents. The cuttlefish has always been around. The matter if somebody says that, we discovered the Techeles and it's a catfish, So we know the catfish, they're around in all of our tanks, whatever, So if we would have known. So he says, therefore, that we have a negative Mesorah, essentially. We have a negative Mesorah that it can't possibly be the cuttlefish. But if there will be some sort of fish that was not so readily accessible to us, and the Murex trunculus as a snail would fall into that category because it was only found in this geographical region where we were exiled from the land of Israel. And even when we were there, we had the Romans looking over us and telling us, don't use this that type of snail, which they used for their royal purposes. So therefore, it would follow that this, if it says the Beis Halevi, that if in fact you did have some type of a fish or some type of a sea creature which would not have been so readily known to us or available to us over the years, that now turns out that it satisfies the simanim and it satisfies the test and everything else, and and you could really prove it's the Techeles, so then I'll be the first one to run to the store and buy it and put it in my tzitzis, or basically what we say that exact lashon. They said I would go along with it 100%. So if that really is what the Beis HaLevi said, and that seems to be the most direct representation by his shliach in terms of what he said, so then certainly the Murex Trunculus would not be knocked out of the ballpark. It would still be a possibility. But the Soloveitchik family, all of the members of the Soloveitchik family in Israel and here in America, or both sons of Moshe Soloveitchik, that's of Yoshabir, of Aaron Soloveitchik, and in Switzerland, they all had this different tradition from the Beis HaLevi. Their version of the Beis HaLevi is that you need a positive tradition, that it's not just a negative tradition, you need a positive tradition, even if it was some sort of a fish that we didn't know about, or a snail that we didn't know about, or wasn't focused upon, and it satisfied all of the criteria. The Murex Trunculus is identified by the Aruch and by others as this porpura. And the porpura really seems to fit all of the definitions of what the chilazon was, in terms of that this was what was used for the royal, the garments and for everything else. We have ancient literature, archaeological evidence, and secular literature going back a couple of thousand years, indicating that this is an exact match. So it doesn't matter. So according to this version of the Beis HaLevi, you can show me Baracha B'tcha Ketana with every single proof and archaeological evidence and so forth, 100% that this is the real Techeles. But if the Mesorah got lost, and it doesn't matter, it's because we didn't even know that this fish or snail was around, but if the Mesorah got lost, so that's it. You need a positive Mesorah. If you don't have that positive Mesorah, so then all bets are off. The same reason why they held not to make a B'rei Minei Mizonos on Oris. But the Gemara says that we have Oris, which is some type of a grain, which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, I think, or Menuri, thank you, Rabbi Yochanan Menuri, was under the impression that it's one of the Chameshis Minei Dagan, and we say, okay, not one of the Chameshis Minei Dagan, exactly, we'll give you Mizonos, but we'll make a B'rei Nefashos at the end. But it's not entirely clear. Is Reiss a Reiss, or maybe Dochin is Reiss, and in the Brisker tradition, the Soloveitchik family, they said that even though there seems to be all of these dictionaries and lexicons that tell us that Reiss is Reiss, there's no question that Reiss is Reiss. Nonetheless, since we don't have a Mesorah that the Reiss is really the Reiss that was lost at a certain point in time, so we have to be worried that maybe it's not really the Mizonos, and we'll make a B'rei Piyadom instead of making a B'rei Minei Mizonos. But that's not the Minhag Olam. What bracha do you make on Reiss? We make a B'rei Minei Mizonos on Reiss. But that was the Soloveitchik family tradition, so they took a very, very hard line. And there were a lot of Talmidim of Rabbi Yoshabir Soloveitchik who actually pushed back on this particular position of his, to say that we don't follow archaeological evidence, because you have the story of Abba Babachan and the Gemara Baba Basra, who, when he was taking a trip in the desert with some Arab horsemen, who was his guide in his tour, and he was showing him this is where the Mesei Midbar are buried, and he got to see the Mesei Midbar for momentarily. So when he came back to his chaverim, back in his yeshiva, they got angry at him that he didn't check their tzitzis, because he could have seen whether their tzitzis were like Beis Shammai, that it had the 4 strings that became 8, or like Beis Hillel that had the 3 strings that became 6, and he didn't check carefully, and he really could have, and that could have been machriya the halacha. So we see that archaeological evidence really is something that's machriya the halacha, and there are that's one of many proofs, but there are many proofs that really show this point. Therefore, now that we have all of these archaeological proofs that indicate that this really could be, and seems to be the type of creature that fits the bill, so to speak, in terms of being the parpura, being this creature from which the Techeles would be extracted, and it really does seem to be the accurate color, so then we should really follow it. So this is the argument that was made by a number of the Rabbanim at the time, and some pushed back and said another argument, which is that if that really is the case, so then it's something which the Gedolim would all endorse. But if it's just like a few rabbis here and there, so we can't take it that seriously. The truth of the matter is that over the years there have been more and more Gedolim who have come around to this position. Besides Rosh Haftar, obviously, is a Gadol, but we saw Belsky wore this type of Techeles, apparently amongst the many different pairs of tzitzis that were worn by Rav Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg. The Techeles made it into the mix as well. and there are many others. So there's a question. Some are very opposed because the Gemara talks about how you had this fake and fraudulent type of wool that was sold as a Techeles that was called the Kollel or Kela Elon. And the Kela Elon basically has been identified as indigo. And now that's something the Aruch says that it's indigo. And if you and they said that it would be like a big avera for people to manufacture Kela Elon and to pretend that it's really Techeles. But the reason why it was such a big avera, the Gemara explains, look at the Gemara Menachos Daf Mem, was because of the fact that they would put it on pishtan garments, and this was wool, and then you would have kilayim if it wasn't really Techeles. But the Gemara also indicates it's lo gar milavan, that if you did use the Kela Elon, that if I use any kind of a string or color, so and it's not really the Techeles color, so at least it counts as the lavan. Let's say I have 8 strings of lavan. That's what I have right now. Are we fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis? So the Gemara says, Hatecheles einam, the Mishnah says, Hatecheles einam Ateres says lavan. The lavan einam Ateres Techeles. That even though you're supposed to have both Techeles strings and lavan strings, how many of each? Big machlokes, right? Rashi and Tosas say 4 of each. This should be half and half. And we have Gemaras and halachos that seem to follow in that assumption that our tzitzis is made up of 2 separate units of 4 strings each, and that's why if you know that what was cut off from a couple of strings were only on one side, and you have the strings on the other side that are intact, you can still wear the tzitzis garment. So we seem to have halachos that are grounded upon this assumption. But of course, Rashi and Tosfos are just one position. You also have the Rambam, whose other position that of the 4 strings, only a half of 1 string was supposed to be colored with Techeles, so therefore it ends up being 1 string out of 8. And the Ravid, who held that it's 2 strings out of 8. There's 1 full string, so it ends up when it's folded over, it's 2 strings out of 8. So it's 3 different opinions. But whichever opinion you follow of those 3, certainly the halacha is that Techeles einam Ateres says lavan, that in the event that you do not have Techeles, you can still fulfill the mitzvah with lavan strings. That would still be permissible. And even if it turned out that this Techeles was in the same realm as, let's say, the Kela Elon, so it would still count as the lavan strings, and it should work in terms, especially since our practice is we don't use pishtan garments, that we only use wool or other types of cotton or other types of garments, but not the pishtan garments, so we don't really have to worry about kalayim. Furthermore, the Gemara says that there's a certain type of, that the Kela Elon is very, very similar to the Techeles, and you have to do a certain type of chemical test in order to show that whether something is going to be Techeles or something is going to be Kela Elon. So Rabbi Lamb came up with this novel discovery because he was also a chemist. So he pointed out that if you check the chemical properties of indigo, and which is identified by the Aruch and others as Kela Elon, and you check the properties of this Murex trunculus dye that comes out, so they basically are exactly the same chemical composition. So others say, you just disproving your point, because the fact that they're the same chemical composition runs against the Gemara, because the Gemara says that there's a certain type of test where you can actually see that with respect to one, you won't be able to extract it through this test, and through the other, you will be able to extract it through the test. But if they are both exactly the same chemical composition, that won't be possible. But that's not necessarily such a perfect kasha. It just means that whatever this test was that the Gemara Menachos tells us about, it's not one that we are so proficient in anymore. That's the Gemara that I have in the materials of Daf Mem Beis Amud Beis, that if you're able to separate the dye, so it's through this test, it's kosher. And if you can't, then if you're not able to separate it, then it's kosher. If you're able to separate it, then it's possible. But we're not able to. Many have tried, and they just say that we've lost the science. You can lose the science of how to do certain bedikos, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this is not actually the Techeles. But let's say that you really got it wrong. So Schechter came up with the observation that there's a separate Beis Halevi. There's a separate Beis Halevi that's actually published in his Tshuvos. It's not just a letter that was written by a Talmud or an acquaintance of the Beis Halevi to the Vizina Rav, but there's an actual Tshuva in the Beis Halevi, which is in, I think, Chelik Aleph Siman Mem Beis, and this Beis Halevi quotes a Turi Even, that's in source 17 of the materials, in which the Turi Even says that there is an issa, there's a violation in the Torah called Bal Sigla, that you're not allowed to reduce you're not allowed to perform an inferior performance of a mitzvah that's considered to be Bal Tigra. So he says, when does Bal Tigra apply? Does Bal Tigra apply according to Turi Even? Let's say that I'm supposed to have Abba Minim and I only use Gimel Minim. I'm supposed to have Dalad Parashios in my tefillin and I only have Gimel Parashios in my tefillin. So he says, that's not Bal Tigra, that's just I haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. The mitzvah is I'm supposed to have Dalad Parashios and I don't have Gimel Parashios. I haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. Bal Tigra is that, like the Gemara talks about in Zvachim, that I'm supposed to sprinkle the korban chad, the blood of the korban chatas, on 4 corners of the mizbeach, and I only sprinkled it on 1 corner of the mizbeach. So I fulfilled the mitzvah, but I violated Bal Tigra. I violated the violation. Thank you, the Yisr of Bal Tigra. So he says that the Bal Tigra is basically when you have a b'di'evet fulfillment of a mitzvah in which you haven't done it b'shlei musa. You haven't done it with all of the bells and whistles. And what's an example that he has of this? He has the example that we have of nowadays, that where you have only the lavan of the outward tzitzis, so since we don't know where the Techeles, so we wear only the lavan strings and not the Techeles strings. So he says that the Rambam paskins that this is considered to be 1 mitzvah as opposed to 2 mitzvahs. It's 1 mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah that when it's not me'akev, the fact that I don't have the Techeles is not me'akev in the sense that it's also not me'akev according to Rabbi Kiva, right? If I sprinkle one sprinkling of the blood, or Rabbi Shiur says I sprinkle only 1 sprinkling of the blood on the mizbeach, so I still fulfilled the mitzvah, but it's a violation of Bal Tigra. So he says that well, how can we wear the tzitzis in this fashion? It's the same idea. It's 1 mitzvah, but I only did the loving part and not the Techeles part of the mitzvah. So isn't that a problem of Bal Tigra? So he says, so am I mutter l'bosh beged bas daled kanfos lahatu bo lovin haobe alav so yesh lovin d'sharm shem esei dochel lo saseh. So he says it's mutter for us to wear the tzitzis because we have a positive commandment, the essay, which overrides the negative commandment of a Bal Tigra. But that's only, it says Rosh Achter, when you need to have the essay be dochel lo saseh because of the fact that it's ef shalakayim shneim. But the Gemara, all the Rishonim are very, very clear. Whenever it's ef shalakayim shneim, so then we don't say essay dochel lo saseh. So therefore he says, since it is a possibility that this new dye that we have found that really seems to conform with all the old traditions of where the Techeles came from, is the real genuine article, the real genuine Techeles. So therefore we're violating Bal Tigra. For sure we're violating Bal Tigra. That's not even a shaila. We're violating Bal Tigra, and we're only relying, according to the Beis Halevi, upon Esei Dochel Lo Saseh. So therefore, since we have an opportunity to use this Techeles and not violate Bal Tigra, or at least there's a chance that we're not violating Bal Tigra, and we're going to perform the mitzvah b'shlei musa. So he says that not only is it appropriate to use this Techeles and mutter to use this Techeles, but it's a chiyuv to use this Techeles. He says otherwise, what are you doing? You're not obligated to, unless you want to just avoid even the riska of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, you're not obligated to go and get yourself an Abba Kanfos in order to wear tzitzis. You could just don't get the Abba Kanfos and don't wear tzitzis. Don't say that to anybody. But obviously we want to do mitzvahs and we want to avoid moments of anger from a Kadosh Baruch Hu. So we wear the tzitzis all the time. But but he says that if you're going to go out of your way to put on tzitzis and do it in a fashion which is going to violate Bal Tigra, and you have a way to put on the Techeles and very potentially not violate Bal Tigra, if it turns out that it's the real Techeles, so then he says that it's also to wear tzitzis nowadays and not put in the Techeles, because then you're violating Bal Tigra. So that's a very, very strong shita that I don't think is shared by most of the other poskim, but ad kedei kach, he feels so strongly that this is something which is appropriate to do nowadays. Now there's a question that some of the poskim say, but what about the fact that Rav Elyashiv has a short tshuva on the subject? He was approached about it, and Rav Elyashiv, it happens that apparently in correspondence with Rav Feivel Cohn, he said that his understanding about the Beis Halevi, in terms of the argument that you need a Mesorah, is more along the lines of what the letter actually says, that if you have a negative Mesorah, that a certain type of fish which we knew about was not identified as the Techeles, so then you have to assume that it's not really the Techeles, the source of the Techeles. But if you discover something that we didn't really know about, so he thinks that the Beis Halevi would be willing to accept that as potential Techeles. It's just that he wasn't necessarily convinced that this Murex trunculus was actually the Techeles. So if you look in the tshuva by Rav Yoshev. So Rav Yoshev, the Kovis Jewish Techeles Galav Simon Beis. So he said what he's worried about is that this Techeles that was found by the Regina Rebbe was turned out to be fraudulent. It turned out not to be a real Techeles. At least everybody other than the Regina Hasidim believed that way. So he says that the same way that he was so convinced that this was the Techeles. In fact, he had the Chaverim. He had rabbinic colleagues who thought that it was Techeles as well. Rav Yitzchak Elchanan apparently thought that it was the real Techeles. It was the real deal. But he said for political reasons, he doesn't want to get involved with this. Wasn't in political reasons because the Reform would say, see, you're changing mitzvah, so we could change mitzvahs too. So he says for that reason he didn't want to get involved. Rav Shechter had a problem with that, but ein chachma vein neiser vein tuna keneged Hashem. The neged Hashem. I mean, if it's the real, this is the way to perform mitzvah deraisa, you shouldn't worry about these things. What?
Unless he just meant mitzvah chumrah, he would wear it bad.
No, but he said he wasn't going to wear it. So that
he would have worn it mitzvah chumrah if not for the political reasons.
Oh, okay, yeah, but it seemed like he held that it was the real thing. But so there were people who thought that the Regina Rebbe's Techeles was the real thing. Then it was discovered that it wasn't. So he said that he's worried that maybe the same thing will happen with this Techeles. That right now everyone is so convinced, and then the scientists and the chemists and all of the experts 20 years from now will discover that, oh no, we got it wrong. It wasn't really the New York trunculus after all. It was the trunculus mirx. I don't know. Well, something else. And so therefore he said that we can't be so we can't be so convinced. And he also quotes the Arizal that maybe it's only Bisman Beis Hamikdash. So he was like Rav Shechter had some trouble with that. Since when is Rav Yoshev paskening based on a metaphysical comment of the Arizal? So he said maybe he didn't really write this tshuva. He just felt that it's dangerous to enter into Techeles territory nowadays. And the Haredi community, everyone's going to go out. It's going to cost. If you tell everybody they have to get Techeles, then it's going to cost a fortune. Nobody will be able to afford it, and they're going to all die of starvation. I don't know. So therefore, I didn't understand that either. But he said therefore somebody else should write this tshuva, and he'll just sign it. And he was surprised that the signon of this tshuva coming from Rav Yoshev. He was a little bit surprised from it. And he also brings, the question that we have a lot of sfeikos. We have a suffix about exactly how is it manufactured. Do you do it without dyes, like Rashi says? Do you do it with dyes? Like the Rambam says, the Gemara discusses dyes, but according to Rashi, that just means the wool that you're placing it on already has the dyes, but not that the Techeles itself goes through a dyeing process. So therefore he kind of slammed the lid and said that not something for us to do. And it's a long explanation that I gave in the Yalkut Yosef about from Yitzchak Yosef, where he goes through all of the different arguments as well as to why we would have to be worried about doing it bisman. Then he also brings a lot of the Mesorah arguments as well, and also the fact that we had this previous case from the Regina Rebbe that turned out that it was really not so reliable, and so he's worried about the fact that maybe it's not going to be reliable here either. And he quotes Rav Yoshev, and he also and he basically brings all of these arguments. And then he says at the very end of all of it, he says Al Kopadim Etzleno Asfaradim. When he talks about the Sfaradim, the practice of the Sfaradim, Meidus and Mizrach, Loveinu Minig Zeitz Rabosenu. He says the way they just didn't see what Rebbeim doing. And now I'm told that there are a couple of Sephardic Gedolim that have done it over the years. What? Rav Mazuz, and apparently Rabbi Chaim in New York. So there are some Sephardic, distinguished Sephardic Rabbanim who do wear it already. But he says the Gedam Gedolei Rabbanim Eretz Yisrael Yerah Kodesh B'nei Brak K'ma Chazon Ish V'Astipler Lo Achmir Mazel Asman. Now, of course, the Chazon Ish and the Stipler didn't have the new discovery of the New York trunculus. They were dealing with the Regina Rebbe's Techeles. It's a different story. Av Shenagu Chumos Rabbos V'Shira Talis. So he says Mizikanim Esponan that it's not something that we necessarily have to do. And he also brings in the Chash L'Yura, that maybe you have to worry you're going to start doing it, and since there are all these Gedolim who don't do it, so you're making it look like you're better and more knowledgeable than they are, so there's this concern about Yura, but others say Yura is only when you're no way to do a Chumrah, like you decide you're going to wear a Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin or something, so you have to be worried about Yura. But if you're doing something in order to fulfill an actual mitzvah, so you don't have to worry about Yura. Now another taina, which they bring in the name of Rav Chaim, and they also quote a Kri Megadim, is that let's say that it is a suffix, because we don't know 100% for sure. It just seems like it's pretty convincing evidence, but we don't know 100% for sure. So the question is, like Oshakta says, we should say Savik Daraisa L'chumra. So it's a Pri Megadim. It says you only say, and this is also a tradition from Rav Chaim, that you only say Savik Daraisa L'chumra when if you're going to do the mitzvah, like you did a mitzvah once and you're not sure you were Yotze, you're going to do it again. So only if when you do it again, you'll definitely be Yotze. Like I shook a lulav and I'm not sure it was kosher, say Savik Daraisa L'chumra, I'm going to take a lulav that's 100% definitely bona fide kosher, now I'll be Yotze. But let's say the second lulav is not 100% clear that it's kosher, so then there's no notion of Savik Daraisa L'chumra. However, seems to be a Ran, it says otherwise, that I'm on the 7th day of Sukkot, I'm going into Shmini Ateres, so do I sit in the Sukkah during Banish Bashas? Not Savik Daraisa L'chumra. I'm not definitely going to perform the mitzvah of sitting in the Sukkah. And the Yosef Mishabura also quotes this in the context of the first when every day of Sukkot, when you want to shake your lulav, and you didn't get around to shaking the lulav the entire day, now it's Banish Bashas. So we say, Savik Daraisa L'chumra, you should shake it during Banish Bashas, but maybe you're not Yosef during Banish Bashas. So he says, no, you should still shake it, because Savik Daraisa L'chumra, you should shake it Banish Bashas. So only a suffix that you're going to fulfill the mitzvah during Banish Mashas, and none less. So it seems that we do pass in that direction. So that's the point that Rav Shechter makes. So Rav Weiss has a long shiur. This I should mention, by the way, that not every Rishon was of the opinion that we pass in like the Chachamim in the Mishnah that the Techeles is not me'akev as a loven. You do have the sheet of the Baal Mor. Baal Mor says we pass like a Rebbe in the Gemara who says that the Techeles is me'akev as a loven, and the Ramban apparently said that the Baal Mor never wore tzitzis. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there because the Baal Mor never wore tzitzis because he held that we pass from like Rebbe that the Techeles me'akev love. We don't have Techeles nowadays, so he says so don't wear the tzitzis altogether. So there is like a shita like that, but obviously we don't follow that shita. But just for full disclosure, that's certainly one of the opinions as well. But according to even the way that we paskin, so Rav Weiss says that he doesn't understand. Savik Daraisa L'chumra. Nobody would have said. 99% of the poskim during the days of the Regina Rebbe wouldn't have said that, the Regina Rebbe says that the cuttlefish, the Techeles, Savik Daraisa L'chumra, let's all go and wear his Techeles. Because it so clearly had so many kashas. So he says, if you look at the literature on this Murus Trunculus, he says that there are a lot of kashas. Number one, they have the kasha that who says that just because it happens to be in this geographical region and it matches the geographical region of the chilazon, that it's necessary the chilazon. He says there are a lot of other fish and snails in that region, and maybe the Techeles came from a chilazon from that region that's now extinct. Maybe there was a fish that once existed, and if you want to look at like the Arizal and some of these midrashim that all talk about how it was nignas, maybe nignas means that it's somewhere in heaven, but it's not on earth anymore because whatever was that species of chilazon doesn't exist. And he says that we have so many different shitos regarding the color. So who says that the color that we have is exactly the right color? It's not really a skyish type of blue, and the Gemara talks about dom eliyam, and it's more of a darkish type of blue. I mean, a lot depends on how much you dye it or dilute it, I suppose. And he says that all of these other terutzim about, it doesn't really have to be Ola Shivim Shana, and it doesn't really have to be a dog, even though, because after all, a snail is not exactly a dog, it just has the contours of a dog, that it's like narrow at the beginning and narrow at the end, and wide in the middle of that. It's the contours of a dog. Who says that that's the correct interpretation, and who says that when we talk about how it has what was the other simon? What?
Domaliyam.
Yeah, there's Doma Liyam. So when it says Gufo Doma Liyam, that's the way in which we're interpreting Doma really is a proper interpretation. Lamaisa, it's not really Gufo Doma Liyam. And he said that I just have so many problems and difficulties with the way in which the data and all of the simanim of Chazal are being interpreted, and all these different explanations are given as if, don't worry about this and don't worry about that and don't worry about the other thing. But when you have to explain away so many different things, and the only simanim that are left are simanim that, it happens to be in a particular region, happens to be able to extract a particular color, that might be true of a number of different types of fish. So he says that I'm not and who says that this wasn't the actual original Kela Iman? Maybe this was the original Kollel. Who knows? So he's not. Oh, you say Kollel is really indigo. Who says that? I should. Who says that when they talk about indigo, that's exactly what we mean when we say indigo? He has a lot of different kashas and a lot of different critiques regarding the current tradition and or regarding this new tradition that has been resurrected regarding the Murex trunculus. So therefore, he is very, very adamant that he doesn't believe that you can rely upon this, or that it even qualifies as a subject to Reiss l'chumrah. And then you have the criticism of Yisrael Reisman. Yisrael Reisman, Shlita also is gung-ho against the Techeles. Just, I have to give, both sides of the equation. Why is he gung-ho about the Techeles? Because the Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Ayin Dal talks about how they used to trap the Chilazim. And the Gemara in Ayin Hey as well talks about trapping the Chilazim. Trapping the Chilazim, it's this slow, the tiny, snail that moves like molasses at this incredibly, slow pace. Where we say that if you can lunge and grab something in one lunge, it's not subject to say the daraisa, it's not subject to being trapped. And here you don't have to it's not too hard to lunge towards the snail. It's not going to run away from you. It's moving as slow as molasses. That clearly that say that wouldn't be applicable. So I don't know. For some reason he considers that to be his bam kasha with respect to the chilazah. And others say it's not such a bam kasha because the way they would trap the chilazah is not when it was out of the water. It was like in the water. In the water, it could slither away at the very bottom of the water bank, and therefore it say that would be applicable.
It's not such an easy thing to find. That Rashi already.
Yeah. So
you showed them already.
But that was his. He has other kashas as well, but that seemed to be his major kasha from what I could tell. With respect to why it shouldn't be chilazim.
It's hard to catch. When it's in the water, it's hard to catch.
When it's in the water, apparently it can slither away and it can hide in different places. It's a little bit, and also it blends in. What?
They're deep.
And also they're very, very deep. As I said, they're on the very floor of the water, so it's not so easy to catch. It's not like you can just lunge and put your hand in. You have to lower the nets, and you got to go through a whole process. So it's not like you can just go and swim together with the chilzonim and catch it in that particular fashion. Now, Rabbi Mordechai Willett Shlita has a different critique, which is that since you do have these different shitos as to whether it should be 4 strings or whether it should be 2 strings or whether it should be 1 string, so he says that it turns out that if you are going to follow if you're not sure whether it's 4 strings or it's 2 strings or 1 string, so you're inevitably going to violate Bal Tikva or Bal Tosif one way or the other if you get it wrong. So he says, let's say the halacha really is that it's 1 string and then you end up using 4 strings, so then you're violating Bal Tosif. And if you really halacha it's really supposed to be 4 strings, then you end up doing 1 or 2 strings, so then you go violating Bal Tikva. So he says that it only makes sense to say that we're going to be on the safe side if we're not 100% sure that this is the Techeles, or even if we are 100% sure, according to his approach, you could actually be 100% sure this is the Techeles, and still be better off not using the Techeles, because the fact that you're going to violate the Bal Tikva or Bal Tosif by putting in the wrong number of strings. According to Rav Shachter, that's not a problem. There's no such thing as the wrong number of strings, because we have different rules as to how we're machriya halacha. And the way that the Ashkenazi community selling is Makriya Halacha is that we follow the traditions of Rashi and Tosas. That seems to be the Mishnah Berurah, seems to follow the tradition of Rashi and Tosas in terms of how he understands Gadumin and the way in which the strings are allocated with each other. So therefore, Rosh Hashanah is not bothered by that at all, because he just says use 4 strings, and that's clearly the halacha. But apparently, according to Rabbi Willig, he did acknowledge that if you're not 100% confident that you always follow Rav Shachter with respect to how you're going to conduct yourself in halacha, and therefore and you're going to do only 1 or 2 strings or something like that. So then you could get into Bal Tikva territory, even if you assume that it really is the Techeles. Others talk about a problem about Tosif. That if it turns not really the mitzvah of Techeles, and you have in mind that you're going to fulfill the mitzvah, so then you could violate Bal Tosif by saying, I'm going to fulfill the mitzvah of Techeles, but you're not really fulfilling the mitzvah of Techeles. So therefore, you would have to have in mind, according to all of those shitos, that when you put on the Techeles, that it should count, if it's not really the Techeles, then it should count like Lavan. It should just be like strings of Lavan. And if it is really the Techeles, so then I intend to fulfill the mitzvah of Techeles. We have to make like Tanai. like you would do if you put on tefillin during Chol HaMoed, right? If I'm not supposed to, so then it's not for the mitzvah, and it's only for the mitzvah if I am supposed to. So says Rabbi Will, not everybody is going to be so proficient in making those Tanaim and so forth. On the other hand, the Rav Shechter camp would say, this is your opportunity to do a mitzvah daraisa, and otherwise you're doing it in a shlobish lemusa fashion, so why not to take seriously your opportunity to do one of this great, tremendous, gebaldika mitzvah daraisa of wearing tzitzis b'shlemusa in the best possible fashion, of wearing techeles. That's the basic breakdown of the different shittas. I have not covered every single criticism and every single potential argument. I have here the Shuvas on Hagos as well that also brings these arguments. And he says, according to, so he addresses that item of why don't you just do it to be on the safe side? So he says, no, because if since our mitzvahs are based upon Masorah, if you don't have a Masorah, so then you don't fulfill anything at all. It's not ein zeh begeder sapek klal. So those who are the opponents, whether it's Rav Asher Weiss, whether it's the Chuvas Ron Hagos, Rav El Yashiv, basically, a large part of their argument is that it doesn't fall into the category of Suffolk, either because you don't have a proper Masorah, or because the fact that there are so many kashas against it, like Rav Reisman says regarding the Tzeda, like Rav Asher Weiss says regarding all of these other the simanim that are in the Gemara that don't necessarily check out. And he says, and I don't trust archaeological evidence because archaeological evidence is just hasharos bi'alma. Now it's quite a question. The Gemara seems to indicate archaeological evidence is better than just hasharas bi'alma, that you can actually rely upon it more fully. So then it doesn't even get into the gather of a suffix. And then he also throws in that there's a problem potentially of losis godedu. Losis godedu. Some people will be wearing it, some people won't be wearing it. But we already have that. You already have some people wearing it and some people don't wear it. It's like now, it wasn't when it first started, so, okay, maybe you go into like a religious Zionist shul in the Shtachim, and that would be the only place where you would find people wearing the Techeles. But now, practically every single shul that I walk into, I find people are wearing Techeles, either openly or secretly and furtively, and since we're all men, so eventually it's going to come out because we're not able to keep ourselves neat all the time, and so eventually people are outed because then the techeles slips out of their shirt and so forth, and you see people are really wearing it. So you see it really all the time. Losis godedu, others point out, really is only applicable when you're dealing in the realm of minim. When you're dealing in the realm of halacha, what do you find losis godedu? Losis godedu, nobody else in my neighborhood builds a sukkah, and I'm the only one building a sukkah. That's losis godedu. Nobody else bought a lulav, and I bought a lulav. That's losis godedu. Nobody else totals the kelim, and I'm the only total. It's not losis godedu. You keep a mitzvah, so hopefully you'll inspire other people. It shouldn't be a violation of losis godedu. So therefore, there are those who say that's not necessarily such a strong raya. And as far as the question of exactly how do you do it right, so one of the questions is how do you wrap it? How do you wrap the techeles? Because Tosfos and the Rambam both say the wrappings are not generally ma'akiv, don't really matter. They mostly matter when you actually have techeles. When you actually have techeles, then they matter. So the Gemara says something about that you should have at least 7 because it's to correspond to the 7 rakiyas. And there are 6 spaces between the 7 rakiyas, so you can go up to 13. So that's why we wrap 7, 8, 11, 13 times and so forth. But some say the 7 is not going on the krichos, but it's going on the chulios. That the number of different batches that you need to have that are separated by double knots need to be at least 7. So Shachar recommends that you do 7 times 7. This way you do the minimum in both directions. But then you have to make sure that the part which the actual chutzin are supposed to be 2/3 the amount of all of the chulios, so it has to end up being like very, very long at the end in order to satisfy all of those opinions. It's a question of do you do them all blue like the Rambam says, or do you alternate blue and white like the Ravid says, or blue and white in terms of the chulios themselves like Toso says. So that gets very confusing, but that part certainly is not me'akev. What Rosh Hashanah recommends is that you do the first, like the Rambam says, that the first wrapping should be white, meaning the first time around should be one white time around this wrapping, and then the last wrapping should be white, and all the others in between, meaning the other 47 out of 49 wrappings.
He says the first 3.
He changed it. Originally he said 1. Then he says the first 3. Right. Okay, first 3 and the last 1. First 3 and last 3?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't remember that. Okay, thank you. Okay, so you have 6 that should be white, the first 3 and the last 3, and the other 43 should all be blue. Okay, and then of course you have a total of 8 double knots, the first double knot and then the 7 additional double knots after each one of the 7 chulios. But again, none of that really is me'akev. to me, the more problematic part is whether you should have 1, 2, or 4 strings. But if you assume that the right number is 4 strings, then you don't have the Rabbi Willig's problem. But otherwise, Rabbi Willig says that's really his bottom line as to why he feels that you shouldn't wear Techeles. So that's interesting. I haven't heard that discussed. He just published this piece like a year ago or so. So that still has to be pondered and considered. I have 4 major rabbinic influences in my life when I was growing up. Ada Yom Hazeh, really from the time I grew up until my years in the Beis Din world and so forth. When I grew up, my major Rebbe was Rabbi Moshe David and he was pro Techeles. My Rebbe Movers of Shefler pro Techeles. Then I have Rabbi Willig, who's not pro Techeles, and then I have Rabbi Gedalia Dov Schwartz, who also did not wear Techeles. So I figured 2 and 2, so Shevi Al Taseh. But I have to say that in terms of just going through the Inyan, one thing Rabbi Belsky said is that he went through the Sugya and Sobel, and he went through the Sugya, so he came to the conclusion that really the proper thing to do is to wear Techeles. But he said, for other people as well, he recommends the same thing. You don't start off doing it until you go through the Sugya properly. So, now that I'm going through the Sugya more, so I have to admit, I'm coming around a little bit more. So that's sort of the general summary regarding the Techeles issue. That the main thing is that we should yearn to perform mitzvahs in the best possible fashion. That's the main thing. We shouldn't yearn to get out of performing mitzvahs. We should yearn to if we can perform mitzvahs Techeles, we should say that would be Gevaldik. So I think that the striving that should come from us, sort of the initial position should be, we really, really want to do this. And therefore, there have to be a strong reason, a compelling reason why not to. And if we discover it's not a compelling reason, and we actually have something that looks like it's the real Techeles, our Netiya, I think, should probably be more in the direction of Oiv mitzvahs, lo yispa mitzvahs. That, we should just want to grab and chop as many mitzvahs as possible. Yeah. Okay.
I'm thinking maybe, do we want to do just Q&A now? Because Diana already davened Marv, so
I'd be happy.
That would be
honestly,
better.
But for me, it would be easier to do Q&A now.
Let's just do the Q&A now.
That works for you.
Okay.
Q&A.
Okay. Okay.
I have a lot of questions. But
We're going to have to limit everyone to one question.
One question at a time.
Going backwards, the Rebbe was saying that Rebbe Willig said there was a problem with Baal Sikra, but how is there a problem with Sikra if Techeles ain't Mekevas Love and Love ain't Mekevas Love? It doesn't mean if they all can be blue, they all can be white. Why does it matter how many?
Because it's still a separate mitzvah of Techeles. It's again, the Rambam happens to hold that it's all within one mitzvah category, but it's one mitzvah category with 2 different elements of it. It's two different elements. So therefore, there is a separate standalone mitzvah of Techeles. You could say the separate mitzvah of Techeles, standalone mitzvah of Techeles, is in still the one category of fulfillment of the mitzvah. This is not necessarily the case that everyone would agree with the Rambam, that it's not the 2 different mitzvahs. The Rambam happens to hold that way. It's a big kash, it's a big discussion, it's a big pilpul, how the Rambam holds that way. But it would even if you hold that way, it's still there is the Rambam himself would agree that it's a mitzvah shlo b'shleimusa. If you learn the Techeles, that the Techeles is an element. It's an important element of the mitzvah, just like the sprinkling of the dam is an important element of bringing a korban. So therefore, you could have Baal Tikva within that element. I think that's the way that you would have to look at it. Next. Yes.
So, one thing that was interesting that you said about how we come to say mazonos for Reiss, because sort of it's commonly understood and used, oros translates to Reiss in multiple tongues, and that is enough sort of for us to say, okay, this is Reiss, and we should then say mazonos. So I'm just I guess the corollary in this case is chilazon to the Greek porifer, the word for this snail from Greek. So my question is would it help to validate from the idea of a lost Masorah, that if we could make strong linguistic links between the hilazon and this porifera word in a similar fashion to how oros is commonly a word for Reiss, does that help with the fact that the Masorah was lost and help to get over that specific difficulty in any way?
That's because you're asking people have been calling it that for a long time. He's saying people have been referring to it.
I think certainly, according to the first version that we have of the Beis Halevi, that there is no deficiency in terms of the Masorah when we don't have a clear Masorah that this is not the chilazon, so then for sure you can rely upon all these archaeological evidence and like. According to if you would have sort of the archaeological evidence regarding something that was right in front of our faces for thousands of years, and then now we had compelling linguistic and archaeological and historical evidence that this really is the genuine chilazon, so that would be more questionable, at least according to the Beis Halevi. But if you didn't hold like the Beis Halevi and you weren't bothered by the Masorah issue altogether, so then that wouldn't be a problem. But if you do accept at least some version of the Beis Halevi, so then it wouldn't work if, for example, you would have unbelievable archaeological evidence regarding the cuttlefish. It wouldn't work. You would still have a problem. But regarding the Murex Trunculus, it could certainly work because that was something that was not immediately in everybody's purview.
Meaning supplementing the archaeological evidence.
Yes. And in fact, they are relying
Yeah.
to a certain degree on all this archaeological evidence, to which, Rav Weiss is unimpressed. Because I think that also depends to a certain degree on your attitude towards science and archaeology and, and Mada, in general. When it comes to all of these things. But look, the Stipleton has a long letter in which he writes that sometimes Mada can be very useful in terms of our ability to identify things. But he says not because we give any credence to secular studies or anything, which is all kfiva and heresy and terrible and awful, and it's and he throws in all the proper lashonos. But he says, but at the end of the day, though, science is sometimes useful.
But I'm asking separately from archaeology, but linguistic study is very similar to how we look at Gemara. I mean, we apply the same
100%, and look at how often Rashi it helps you understand something by giving you the French analog in terms of the language, so that you can figure out exactly what he's saying. But, in the Charaya Gedola Mizu, the Rashi does that practically in every single page of Shas. And we just pass over those Rashis because most of us don't know Old French, and probably even the modern day French don't know Old French so perfectly. But Rashi does that all the time. It's part of being a master educator.
If I remember one of the Techeles videos that's on YouTube, you can see they show one of the snails to, I think it was like a Greek fisherman, and they're like, what is your word for this? And it's very similar to chilazon. So there is linguistic similarity.
Right. Plus they came up with all these old royal garments, that are in this color, and that were made from this chilazon. Yeah. Right. What do you think was?
So if one wanted to wear a pair of sneya, would that be a problem because you have one with and without? Is that some kind of a...
No, it wouldn't be a problem. In fact, some of the posts can even recommend to avoid the Euro problem, so just to wear it besina, wear it under your clothing, and there are Gedolim who have done this, who actually do wear the tzitzis underneath their clothing. There was one major Gadol where it came out at one point and it was like a whole big scandal. So they recommend if you're going to do it, either your talis katan or your talis gadol, it's better to do it your talis katan because you wear that all the time. So this way you'll be able to fulfill the mitzvah all the time. Rather than doing it in talis gadol and you'll only perform it a little bit of the time, right? Especially if it's only like your Shabbos talis or something like that. So it's actually on some level even better that way. And Rosh Hashanah says that you should do it with all your talesim because.
Who was the gadol that came out?
I forgot. I can tell you, but I just don't remember off the top of my head who it was.
I was saying bracha then if you're in Techeles and in Talis Katan, but you say bracha in Talis Gadol.
Which one would be the same?
Wouldn't it be better to say bracha in
According to most poskim, you are fulfilling the mitzvah. Even Rosh Hashanah will tell you you're performing a mitzvah in the talis gadol. You're doing an aveira too, but it's a mitzvah baba aveira.
He's asking which one's better to make a bracha.
I'm saying
if you're going to do both, is it better? We normally say lisatip in the talis gadol, and we have in mind to be mostly talis gadol. I still do it the same way.
Next, anyone else?
We have
this is a little bit more general, but applying to your. So let's say it's not a suffix to the level of suffix to Reiss l'chumra. We waste so much money now. I'll speak for myself. I waste a lot of money. So, something that I would have spent $60 on that I don't need. Is there an idea? I'll spend the $60 and get a pair of Techeles. I'm not mechuyev to in the level of suffix to Reiss l'chumra, but is there still an inyan then if somebody wants?
There's
to
also downsides. Yes,
the
what's the
economical
downside?
argument is the one that I find the hardest to understand because it doesn't cost a fortune. It doesn't cost a fortune. So people say, I had to spend so much money on a suffix. It's not so much money. It's not so much money considering what we spend on other things. Do you ever go out to showers? I don't know. I'm sorry?
But they say this to talk about Israel.
No, I understand. And Rav Schachter took it seriously coming from Eliyashi. He said that he was very compassionate, towards the people who are really, Kollel couples who are really struggling and so forth. So I get that on some level. But certainly here, for most of us, I don't think that's really a concern per se. I just, I don't see that as a major reason not to do it. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I just wonder this idea that the Gufei Dermal Yam is not literal, but clearly the color of Techeles, right? The Dermal Yam, which is Dermal Rekia, which is Dermal, we take that very literally in the same sugya. So Daima, in one context, we take hyper literally to the point that the shade has to match whatever, and then the same sugya, Gufei Dermal Yam, is kind of amorphous. Is that not?
They're two different prices.
It's different prices.
Two different prices.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm saying it might not be considered the same sugya. It's two different prices on the same page.
Right, they are. They really don't. There is this one price on Daf Mem Dalet and Aleph, which has all of these, dome type of comparisons. But then, in terms of the comparison to the Yam and so forth, that really is very much specifically targeted towards the comparison in color itself. That's on in Chulin Daf Pei Tessim and Aleph and otherwise, because it says Manishtana Techeles Mikolat Sibonim, where it's clear that the comparisons that we're making are not with respect to shape or form or metaphysical quality, but very specifically color. So I think that's the difference. Yeah.
Is there anyone else that has their first question? Okay, all right.
You okay? Okay, fine.
When Rav Schachter and spoke, but they're Rebbeim, like Soloveitchik and Moshe, were they speaking on behalf that maybe they would agree to this as well, or are they just coming up on a new?
I think Rav Schachter understood that Rav Soloveitchik was already obligated to follow his family tradition. But he made a point of saying that this is not an example where if you have a Talmud who's Sugil Hara, like Rav Schachter, that he would be obliged to go along with his Rebbe's minhag, which is not a minhag, it's a halacha. And I think that he felt that the Soloveitchik family version of the Beis Halevi approach towards Masorah was not as mistaber as the officially written version of the letter that was given over to the Regina Rebbe. I think he's made that clear in a number of his different presentations. But he also was very clear that Rav Soloveitchik himself really did follow the more extreme version of the Beis Halevi's shita. Yeah.
And what Rabbi Temler?
What?
And Rabbi Temler?
Rabbi Temler what?
No, with Rav Moshe.
So, Shabtai Rappaport spoke once. He's
Okay.
his grandson,
Yeah.
Moshe. So he said he spoke with Moshe, and Moshe told him that he trusted him to learn the sugya and make a decision. So whether and Rav Shabtai Rappaport or Techeles. So, but he didn't say that Rav Moshe said it's about anybody.
Right.
else.
I don't think that we can really cite Rav Moshe as having an opinion pro or con regarding this particular issue, because in when this particular discovery was made in the 1980s, Rav Moshe was already not either he had already been nifter, he was already very ill, but he's with the final stages of his life. He was nifter, I think 1986, Rav Moshe was nifter, so I don't think that it really came up for Rav Moshe to register an opinion about it, and none of this would go against Rav Moshe. To the extent that there is that Rav Moshe weighed in on the fact that he clearly, I think, accepted the Rambam's position regarding the dyeing process, that it wasn't that the Techeles was something that automatically emerged, but was something that you did use samamonim in order to produce the Techeles. So I gave that, that particular tshuva of Rav Moshe, because that's really all that I found in terms of Rav Moshe weighing in on this particular issue.
In fact, so just Rabbi Willig and his concern for Baltigra.
Yeah.
Does he address?
I mean, he's also worried about Tosef. He says,
so those two.
Right. In the event, he says that you're not fulfilling the mitzvah, so you have to worry about Baltosif. And if you are fulfilling the mitzvah, you have to worry about Tigra. It's kind of like funny how that.
So I have a question. So the Baltosif, doesn't the Gemara say Ein El Lavan, which means there's no Baltosif?
No, but
if it's the wrong thing.
Yes, you couldn't be kind the mitzvah Lavan, but if you have the intention to fulfill the mitzvah.
But those people had intention. The people that were wearing the faith.
Yeah. So the point is that you're still performing the mitzvah, even if you violate Baltosif. You could still perform the mitzvah, but the Baltosif is that you have in mind that you're also fulfilling the union of Techeles when you're only fulfilling the union of Lavan. That's the Baltosif problem. That's the Baltosif problem. It's in Kavanah. Your Kavanah is to perform the mitzvah of Techeles, and really you're only performing the mitzvah of Lavan. That's good. You're still performing the mitzvah. You're 100% right.
And on the Baltigr, what does he say to?
I mean, I'll be pashtus.
What does he say?
You'll find some who will say that based on certain Lishonos in the Gemara regarding Kollel, that maybe you don't fulfill the mitzvah either, altogether. But the pashtus is that you do fulfill the mitzvah, and the concern about Kollel was a concern of Kilayim. That's the pashtus. Yeah.
And what does he say about the Baltigr of the Beis Halevi that if there is Techeles by wearing Lavan, you're over Baltigr?
He doesn't address that so much. I don't recall in terms of the Turei Even. It could be addresses that, but I don't remember.
Because he's worried for Baltigra, but if you don't wear it also.
I'd have to look at his piece as to whether he's worried. It could be addressed that, but I don't. I just don't remember 100% he addresses that. Yeah.
Okay. Kind of theoretical.
Yeah.
Maybe end of this. What would your advice be to somebody who's maybe new to Judaism, trying to grow maybe at a site? Would you try to maybe push them away from Techeles at this point, or is it something for them to consider?
No, I would say there's something to consider. Look, the main thing for somebody who is new to Judaism was about tshuva. I say, read the Kitzur Shulchan. Make sure that you're following all the halachos of yom that you're supposed to do and so forth. And when you get all of that straight and you have developed a good routine in terms of your daily routine, your Shabbos routine, your Yom Tov routine, and, in terms of your brachos, in terms of your kashrus, and in terms of your anhagos, in every other way. So you're at the very least fulfilling tzitzis in terms of wearing, lavan. So then, once you have all of that in order, so then you figure out next steps. That's what I would say. But I would say when you get to that point in your observance, then definitely think about next steps and talk to your rebbeim and so forth. Everything that I'm saying should be done in consultation with your rebbeim for sure. Because that's part of the Yura, that we shouldn't be so arrogant to think that we're so much better than our Rebbeim. Some people are. You have a Rav Shechter, who's certainly a Gadol b'Yisrael, so he can come to certain clear-cut conclusions. I think that all of us, speaking for myself anyway, are very much subservient to our Rebbeim. That's why I said with my Rebbeim I had a split vote, on some level with respect to this issue, but I don't trust myself completely. I do feel, based on the split vote, that I now am at a point where I do have the ability to explore. I don't think that any of my Rebbeim, speaking about Rabbi Willig and certainly the late Rav Schwartz, would have been opposed to my coming to this particular conclusion. But I think that it is appropriate for all of us to do this proper research on our own, with our Chabbeim, with our Rebbeim, and so forth, and to come to whatever conclusion we come to at the end. But if the conclusion is that it's a good thing, so then I think, go for it.
The same rubric, should we also be changing our dalads to dalads because it fits better with the extending the dalad of echad, etc.
That's a different shiur. Okay.
Thank you so much.